Yep. You wanna?
Okay. Show goes on. Hello. I'm Nancy with the Larkspur Historical Society. Tonight you're going to meet 4 characterized early pioneers as early settlers to what has become Douglas County. The early
remember that.
pioneers specifically are from Huntsville.
He's got his, but we don't want to forget Bev's.
And the East and West Plum Creek areas. With 19th century manners, some of which are around today, I will introduce our ladies first. I'm going to back up here. May I go over here? Sure. I would like you to meet Sarah Coberly. This is Sarah. Sarah arrived in our Kansas territory that would become Douglas County as one of the famous 59ers. Sarah was the first lady and lady entrepreneur to settle in Douglas County, the first lady to settle in our county. Sarah is characterized by Kimberly Greer. And then, to my lovely right is Pearl James Grout. Pearl is our second lady, a pioneering woman who ranched on Jackson Creek Road. You will hear just how hard work was for a settler in early Douglas County. Pearl is characterized by red nose. And for the men, we had the honor of having our 4th territorial governor with us tonight, Alexander Cameron Hunt. Hunt's term as governor was 1867 to 1869. You will be surprised by all the accomplishments of A.C. Hunt, both in office and outside of his governor's term. Governor Hunt is characterized by Rodger Greer.
Thank you.
And lastly, we have Daniel C. Oakes, was somewhat a jack of all trades and was instrumental in causing the 100,000 59ers people who came into Douglas County during the 1859 gold rush. 100,000 people came to our county. He was also credited with establishing the Indian agencies in Colorado. D.C. Oakes is characterized by Larry Schultz. Do you want me to?
Well, yeah, that'd be
The
nice.
words you will hear from our pioneers tonight are the words used during the time of their history. Most notably, the people of our tribal nations are referenced by our pioneers as Indians. As you likely know, what we called Indians in the 19th century and early 20th century referenced themselves as the people. And without further ado, shall we start with our illustrious governor?
All right. Thanks for coming. I'm Alexander Cameron Hunt. Cam to my friends and family. I was born in Hammondsport, New York in 1829, though the record keepers of my life never agreed on much, and I've stopped correcting them. My family moved to Freeport, Illinois when I was still a boy, and I sat in the first school the town ever opened, and that was in Indian Territory right before I moved there, so very similar to moving here. That school was the whole of my formal education, and I never apologized for it. In 1849, I caught the fever everyone was catching that year, gold, California, the whole gaudy promise of it. I traveled to California in 1849 to join the California gold rush, and I did well enough at it. Came home to Freeport a rich man, or rich enough, started a family, started up some business ventures, got myself elected mayor. I thought I had it figured out. I want to tell you something before I go further. In 1854, thank you, General Palmer. In 1854, before I married my Ellen, I wrote a letter to her mother, Mrs. Kellogg. She had asked, as mothers do, about the state of my soul, whether I intended to unite myself with some church or denomination. I told her the truth. And the truth was, I had spent a great portion of my life among rough men of the world, and among them I had found the truest hearts, and it is to them I would turn in my hour of need. He literally wrote that. I told her I held aloof from societies, sects, and unions of every kind. I believed there was an all-wise hand directing and shaping each life, and that with him I was content to leave my destiny. I've never joined a church, and that has cost me standing with certain respectable circles over the years. I've made my peace with that cost. Then came 1859 and the panic. I learned the lesson that money made quick can be lost quicker. I was ruined, flat. Ellen and I came west in '59 with 2 small children, chasing the Pikes Peak rush. I won't repeat the whole of that crossing. Ellen's diary does it better than I ever could, and she earned the right to tell it, being the one who lay near death in the back of a timber wagon, while I cooked and drove and minded our babies and the 20-some people who had nowhere else to turn. We arrived in Auraria poorer than when we started, ran an eating house into the ground, and finally found some solid footing with a livery stable. That was the shape of those early years: failure, then just enough success to try again. Auraria and Denver in those days had no law but what men made for themselves. There was a vigilance committee, and their motto suited the times exactly. If Kansas wouldn't govern us, we'd govern ourselves. I served as a delegate when he drafted the Organic Act for the territory of Jefferson, a government that Washington never once recognized, and that dissolved the moment the real Colorado Territory came into being. And I sat as a judge of the People's Court, trying to bring some daylight into proceedings that had until then been settled mostly with fists and ropes. Now, there is a curious thing history has never quite settled about me. I'll pretend not to settle it now. Somewhere in that same stretch of time, 30 miles south of where I was building the first brick house in Auraria and nursing my sick wife, a little settlement in the Divide Country took my name, Huntsville. My friends D.C. Oaks and Sarah Coberly called it that, though I cannot tell you to this day exactly why that honor came to me, because I was not yet governor. I was just the judge of the People's Court. I did, however, know D.C. Oaks very well. We were nearly partners in everything we did. A historian of that time wrote that I seemed more nearly capable of being in 2 or more places at the same moment than any man of his time, and I was often rash and headstrong, but rarely weak or vacillating. I've decided to take that as a compliment, and maybe that explains how I got down here into this part of Douglas County. President Abraham Lincoln made me the 2nd U.S. Marshal of this territory in 1862, and I held that badge through '66, through the worst of the Civil War, through fears that Confederate raiders might slip into our gold fields, through the long, bitter unrest with tribes that drove Divide area settlers into log forts for months at a stretch. I traveled this territory a great deal in those years, often alone, and I'll confess no one kept a careful record of where I went or what I found there. What I can tell you is that my dealings with the Indians learned a reputation I didn't entirely expect. A party of settlers once traveled clean through hostile country and came to no harm simply by saying they were known to me. General Palmer once asked me to persuade an encampment at Glen Erie to move along, and they did so peacefully. Out of regard for me, I'm not certain. I will also tell you, since you're here, that I once threw Chief Colorado down a flight of stairs. He was a bully, and he tested me past the point a proud man could let pass, and I've never lost a night's sleep over the matter. Good relations with people do not require tolerating every insult they offer, any more than good relations between neighbors do. The battle at Sand Creek happened during those years, and I will not soften what I felt about it then or feel about it now. I interviewed the soldiers who were there. I heard what they could not quite say, looking me in the eye. I have no doubt I was counted among the officials the Rocky Mountain News saw fit to threaten for doubting Chivington's account. And in 1865, I went to Washington and told Congress plainly that people had been slaughtered under a flag that was supposed to protect them. That cost me friendships in this territory that I never recovered. I would make the same choice again tomorrow. I understood that I had placed my life in jeopardy by testifying against Chivington. When asked about the general feeling among whites in favor of exterminating the Indians, I replied, "That feeling prevails in all new countries where the Indians have committed any depredations. And most especially will people fly off the handle in that way when you exhibit the corpse of someone who had been murdered by the Indians. When they come to their sober senses, they reflect that the Indians have feelings as well as we all have, and are entitled to certain rights, which, by the way, they never get. The threat to go for them was not an idle threat. In April of 1864, a month after I testified, Silas Soule was assassinated in an alley in Denver. He had refused to allow his company to participate in the slaughter. It was his detailed letter to Major Wynkoop that triggered the congressional investigation. His widowed wife was Hersa Coberly, daughter of Sarah Coberly, who along with D.C. Oaks had founded Huntsville. President Johnson gave me the governorship in 1867. I traveled to Washington the following year with Kit Carson and my old friend D.C. Oaks, as well as others, escorting Chief Uray and a delegation of Ute leaders. And together we negotiated what's come to be called the Hunt Treaty, or the Ute Treaty, or the Carson Treaty, depending on how you want to say it. Together we negotiated and gave 16 million acres of the western slope to be set aside as a Ute reservation. I believed at the time I was doing a generous thing. I've lived long enough since to understand it was also a taking, dressed in the language of the era, but a taking all the same. I was relieved of governorship in '69, not long after, while I was still occupied trying to get the Utes proper equipment to farm land that I'd helped set aside for them. President U.S. Grant wanted the seat for a man of his own choosing, and that was the end of it, delivered without ceremony, without much explanation. I'll tell you a story about that because it still makes me smile more than it makes me bitter. Some years later, President Grant came through the territory and he took me aside to a window and he told me plainly, "I believe that you've been wronged." And I told him just as plainly that my removal had been an outrage. "Well," he said, "I will make you a present then of a stud horse worth $5,000 if you will send a man to St. Louis to look for the animal." I sent for the horse. Claymore they called him, or Peacemaker some said. And I suppose that is fine as an apology as any territorial governor ever received from a sitting president. I've been paid in worse currency for greater injuries. In the 1870s, I started to amass land on what is now known as Hunt Mountain, the site of the current J.A. Ranch. My daughter described the venture, though, as follows. In the summer of 1873, Father established a large stock ranch, bought large numbers of horses, and was shamefully cheated in many instances because of his utter ignorance of these animals. The ranch was located on the divide midway between Denver and Colorado Springs, and as beautiful a spot as I've ever seen. The Douglas County News article of 1876 was more generous to me, including my ranch among the most notable. Quote, "Douglas County has advanced from a wilderness county with scarcely 50 white inhabitants to 2 counties with a population of 6,000. She has cattle grazing and growing on 1,000 hills, thousands of acres of land improved and fenced, some of the finest and best stock ranches in the state of Colorado, notably C.W. Perry's, Governor Hunt's, Dr. Bucktel's, and I. Van Wormer's. Scores of farm dwellings, houses as handsome and conveniently arranged as can be found in any of the old states of the Union." The railroad years gave me back some of what politics had taken. In 1871, the Articles of Incorporation for the Denver and Rio Grande Railway were signed by just 3 people, W.J. Palmer, Alexander Hunt, and W.H. Greenwood, authorizing $2.5 million in stock. Palmer was a mover and shaker. He knew a lot of people back east, and the money flowed east to west, and we got our railroad started. I also understand it was said that I was worth $500,000 at that time, which would be $14 million in 2026. The fortune was probably only on paper, or perhaps it was used to amass the ranch on Hunt Mountain. As was the pattern with Palmer, we built new towns just short of existing settlements, so we could self-fund the narrow gauge railway by developing the real estate. The idea was that we would reach Mexico City. The first depots, however, were established right here in Divide Country, including Larkspur, named by my wife Ellen, and Sybil, which was renamed Greenland, when the poet and author Helen Hunt Jackson passed through on our narrow gauge. I have never once ridden past Larkspur without thinking of my Ellen. When Palmer directed me to purchase 600 acres near Colorado City, I telegraphed back that I'd purchased 2,000. The land became Colorado Springs, Palmer's little Paris. As president of the Denver and Rio Grande Construction Company, I was his field commander when 2,000 men needed managing across some of the roughest ground in the territory. There were always competitors on our heels. When he started our railway up the Arkansas, the Denver and Rio Grande crews were confronted by the crews of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, who were attempting to control the chokehold of the Royal Gorge to access the mineral wealth of the Leadville Bonanza. The Santa Fe had hired Bat Masterson and armed thugs to guard their illegal claim. I organized a local army, and our force secured passage for the Denver and Rio Grande while avoiding bloodshed. The Santa Fe had hired C.S. Smith, a noted bridge engineer, to build the hanging bridge that still exists under the Royal Gorge Bridge. We took it over after winning the Royal Gorge War. I named towns as I built them because the locations reminded me of places in Mexico, which I had scouted for the railroad. Salida, Alamosa, Durango. I rode into Durango on the first passenger locomotive in 1881, one day after the last spike went into the wood. There are men who build fortunes. I built towns. I'm not entirely certain looking back which is the more foolish ambition. I've made and lost enough fortunes now that I've stopped counting them, and I would be lying to you if I said the losses were the hardest part of my life. They were not. In 1880, my Ellen died. She was 44 years old. She'd crossed the plains in constant pain and buried none of her children on that crossing. My son Robert Bruce was born in Auraria in 1860 after my wife Ellen lay in bed for 3 months. The baby struggled for life as I gave him and his mother what care I could, even as rain soaked through the roof of the cabin. Bruce lived to be his mother's pride and joy. In 1883 in Durango, however, the very town I'd ridden into behind the first locomotive, he was murdered during a bank robbery in a town I helped raise out of the dirt. I do not know how to speak of those years without my voice failing me, so I will simply tell you that it happened and that I was never entirely the same afterward. Frank Hall was right about me. I was rash, I was headstrong, but I was rarely weak. I built a government out of nothing. I condemned a massacre when condemning it cost me dearly. I helped draw the lines of a reservation I now understand as a kind of theft. I kept building anyway. Building was the only thing I ever truly knew how to do with grief. I died in Washington in 1894, a long way from every ranch and railroad and treaty table I'd ever stood at, estranged then by my own daughter, for reasons I won't burden you with tonight. Palmer and I had parted ways years earlier, but after my death, he quarried a stone from Ute Pass west of Colorado Springs and had it placed at my graveside in Washington, D.C. That's the whole of it, or as much as it as an old man can give you in one sitting. Huntsville is Larkspur now, and my wife chose that name, and I think she chose better than I ever did. I'll let that stand as the last word on the matter.